They moved my seat at my husband's funeral before the flowers even arrived. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the chapel, with my black gloves folded in one hand, and the small silver cross Charles had given me resting cold against my throat. The front row was full, not with strangers, with family. My family. His sister, our son Daniel, and Daniel's wife Vanessa sat together beneath the soft white arrangements as if grief had assigned them rank and I had somehow lost mine. My card had been placed 3 rows back near the aisle, beside a cousin I had not spoken to in nearly 6 years. For a moment, I simply stood there, not because I was confused, because I understood exactly what I was looking at. Vanessa turned first. She rose with that polished little smile she used when she wanted to sound kind in front of witnesses. "Eleanor," she said, touching my elbow lightly, "we thought this spot might be easier for you." Easier for me. I looked at the front row again, at my husband's framed photo, at the seat that should have been mine. Then I looked at her hand and watched her remove it. "How thoughtful," I said. My voice came out calm. That seemed to disappoint her. Around us, the room glowed with funeral home softness. Cream-colored walls, white roses, a pianist in the corner touching the keys so gently it almost sounded like someone apologizing. People lowered their voices when I passed, but not enough. I caught fragments the way you catch cold air near a door left cracked open. Poor Eleanor. I heard Charles left things complicated. She'll probably have to sell. I don't know what she'll do now. I kept walking. Slow. Straight-backed. Charles used to tell me that dignity was not something people gave you. It was something they failed to take, no matter how hard they tried. I repeated that to myself as I sat in the seat they had chosen for me. From there, I had a clear view of Vanessa leaning toward Daniel, whispering with the confidence of a woman who believed the room had already been arranged in her favor. Daniel did not look at me. That hurt more than I expected. Not because he had chosen his wife over me. Men have done weaker things for prettier reasons. No, what hurt was how natural it looked. As if this had all been decided long ago. As if widowhood had reduced me from wife to inconvenience in a single morning. When the minister began speaking, I lowered my eyes to the program in my lap and saw that my own name had been printed wrong. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. My name was Whitmore. It had been Whitmore for 42 years. I ran my thumb over the ink once, then closed the paper carefully. Someone had approved that. Someone had seen it and let it stand. After the service, people lined up to offer condolences that felt rehearsed, gentle words wrapped around sharp curiosity. Vanessa accepted them like a hostess at a luncheon, guiding people, collecting sympathy, deciding who belonged close to the family and who did not. Then I heard her say, soft but clear, "We're just trying to make sure Eleanor is taken care of. These next few months may be an adjustment for her financially." Financially? I turned my head just enough to catch the pity bloom across another woman's face. That was the moment I understood this was not carelessness. It was strategy. They wanted me small before they wanted me silent. They wanted the room to believe I was already fading, already dependent, already finished. I said nothing. I only reached for my handbag, straightened my coat, and looked once more at Charles's photograph. They treated me like I was broke. And I let them. Because not one of them knew what I had never mentioned. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not the people whispering behind funeral flowers. Not a soul in that room knew about the $50 million. After the burial, everyone drifted to the reception room across the cemetery grounds as if sorrow had a schedule to keep. The space was warm, polished, and quiet in the expensive way people mistake for respect. Silver trays, white linen, coffee served in real cups, not paper. A long table of finger sandwiches and small pastries that no one touched without first glancing around to see who else had started eating. I stood near the windows with my hands folded over my handbag and watched grief turn into social order. That is always how it happens. The prayers end, the chairs scrape back, and suddenly people remember who they are to one another when the dead are no longer in the room to hold them in place. Vanessa moved through that reception like she belonged at the center of it. She thanked people for coming, lowered her voice at the right moments, and accepted sympathy with a softness so polished it almost deserved applause. If you did not know her, you would have called her gracious. If you knew her, you would have recognized the precision. She was not receiving condolences. She was managing perception. Every few minutes, someone would look over at me and then quickly away. Not with cruelty. Something worse. Assessment. I had seen that look before in charity luncheons and estate meetings, The expression people wear when they're trying to decide whether your life is still intact or whether it has started coming apart at the seams. Then I heard my name. Not spoken to me. Spoken about me. Two women near the coffee service. Friends of Charles from the club, both dressed in tasteful black and pearls that sat neatly against their throats. Vanessa says Eleanor may need help with the house, one whispered. The other gave a small sympathetic sigh. At her age, that is probably for the best. At her age. I almost smiled. I was 68, not fading wallpaper. I knew exactly how much it cost to heat the Whitmore house in January, how much Charles had paid in property taxes last year, and which investment account had outperformed every other one for 6 straight quarters. But none of that would have mattered to women like that. They were not discussing my competence. They were discussing my decline. I turned slightly and saw Daniel standing near the fireplace with a bourbon he had not yet tasted. He looked tired, pale, older than he had yesterday. For one brief second, I saw the little boy who used to run across our back lawn in Connecticut with grass stains on his knees and Charles's laugh in his chest. Then Vanessa touched his arm and the look disappeared. He bent toward her. She said something low. He nodded. And there it was again, that same terrible ease from the chapel, as if decisions about me were already being made in rooms I had once owned by love alone. Grace found me beside the window a few minutes later. She did not kiss the air near my cheek or offer one of those careful, empty condolences people use when they are hoping not to be pulled into real feeling. She simply stood beside me and said, I need to tell you something before Vanessa tells everyone else. I turned to her. Grace had Charles's eyes, clear and steady, and she had always been the only one in this family who understood that silence could mean many things besides weakness. She called Aunt Miriam yesterday, Grace said. And Aunt Louise. Maybe others too. She told them you were not prepared, that your accounts were strained, that Daniel was going to step in after today. I did not answer right away. Outside the glass, the sky was pale and cold, and rows of headstones stretched back across the hill like quiet witnesses. Step in, I repeated. Grace nodded once. She is building a story, making it sound generous. That did not surprise me. It explained too much for surprise. The moved seat, the wrong last name, the comments about adjustment, the pity in strangers' faces. None of it had been random. Vanessa was laying soft fabric over a hard intention, and she was doing it so elegantly that half the room would later swear she had only been trying to help. Grace touched my sleeve. I do not think Daniel understands how far she is taking this. I looked across the room again. My son laughed once at something a man said, then quickly lowered his face as if he had forgotten where he was. That hurt more than it should have. Not because he laughed, because he still believed he could stand beside me in public and behind me in private and call himself a good man. He understands enough, I said. Grace studied me for a second, then lowered her voice. There is more. I heard Vanessa asking whether Charles ever changed the trust before he died. Now that made me still. Not visibly. Years of marriage had taught me how to keep my face from delivering what my mind had already concluded. But inside, everything became very quiet. She was not guessing. She was searching, which meant this was no longer about status after a funeral. It was about access, control, ownership. I smoothed the front of my coat and glanced toward the long mirrored wall where Vanessa stood speaking to a small circle of guests. She looked perfect in black, controlled, tender, concerned. The kind of woman magazines used to call composed. Charles had once called that type dangerous because they never raised their voices when they reached for something that was not theirs. Do not say anything yet, Grace murmured. I was not planning to, I said, and I meant it. There is a kind of power in being underestimated that the arrogant never recognize until it is too late. They mistake silence for confusion, restraint for fragility, grief for surrender. I let my gaze rest on Vanessa one moment longer, then lifted my coffee cup and took a slow sip. She wanted the room to believe I was a widow drifting toward dependence. She wanted sympathy to soften the ground before she planted her claim. That was fine. Let her water the lie. Let Daniel stand beside her and call it concern. I had spent 42 years with Charles Whitmore. I knew when a performance was being staged, and I knew exactly when to let the curtain rise. Grace left my side before anyone noticed we had been speaking too long, and I remained by the window long enough to let her warning settle into its proper place. Not at the surface, where shock lives. Deeper than that. In the quiet space where a woman begins rearranging the truth she thought she understood about her own family. Charles had been gone for less than 4 hours, and already Vanessa was sending out trial versions of a new story, one where I was fragile, unprepared, and waiting gratefully for younger hands to take over. That was the part that would have offended Charles most. Not the greed. He had always said greed was common, predictable, almost dull. No, what would have offended him was the staging of it. The careful manners, the measured voices, the way people used concern like lace draped over a locked door. I set my coffee cup down untouched and moved slowly through the reception room, stopping when stopped, nodding when spoken to, accepting condolences from people who meant well and from people who wanted information dressed as compassion. A man from Charles's board pressed my hand and told me Charles had always been the strongest man in any room. I thanked him and almost said that he was wrong. Charles was not the strongest man in any room. He was simply the clearest. He could look at a person for 10 minutes and know whether they were loyal, ambitious, frightened, or dangerous. He had read Vanessa correctly the first Thanksgiving she attended. He was never unkind to her, but afterward, while we were rinsing plates in the kitchen, he dried a serving spoon and said, very casually, "That one does not like not being centered." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Vanessa was polished, educated, pretty in that deliberate way that photographs beautifully, and she knew exactly how to make a new family feel flattered by her interest. She asked about recipes, remembered birthdays, sent flowers with handwritten notes. It all looked so graceful. But grace and calculation can wear the same perfume, and I had learned that too slowly. Daniel crossed the room then, finally approaching me with his bourbon still in hand. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice, "are you doing all right?" There are questions people ask because they want the truth, and questions they ask because the shape of the sentence makes them look decent. This was the second kind. "I buried my husband this afternoon," I said. "So, I suppose that depends on your definition of all right." He glanced down, embarrassed, then gave the sort of sigh men give when they would rather be forgiven than understood. "Vanessa is just trying to help with things," he said. There it was. Not even hidden. Not after tonight. Not after the seat. The whispers, the false pity folded into every conversation. "With what things?" I asked. He shifted his glass from one hand to the other. "The house. The paperwork. Everything that is going to be a lot. A lot." Such a small phrase for such an enormous trespass. I studied my son's face. He had Charles's jaw, my eyes, and at that moment neither one seemed to be doing him any favors. "You mean the things I have managed for decades," I said quietly. "You mean the accounts I understand, the home I built, the decisions your father and I made long before either of you began rehearsing concern in public." His face tightened. "That is not fair." "No," I said. "It is accurate." Vanessa appeared before he could answer, one hand resting lightly at his back, claiming the moment without appearing to. "Eleanor," she said with that same polished sympathy, "we were only saying you should not have to carry everything alone." I turned to her fully then, and for the first time all day, I let a little stillness enter the space between us. She held my gaze, confident but careful. She was waiting to see whether grief had made me weak or merely quiet. "You are right," I said. "A woman should never carry more than what truly belongs to her." Something flickered in her eyes. Not fear. Not yet. But the first small disturbance of certainty. Daniel looked between us as though he had wandered into a conversation in a language he should have recognized, but did not. Vanessa smiled, though it took more effort this time. "Exactly," she said. "That is all we want." I believed that. She wanted exactly that. Only her definition of what belonged to me was about to disappoint her very badly. Across the room, Grace caught my eye and looked away just as quickly, as if to say she was watching. Good. Let someone watch. Let someone remember how gently this began. Because by then I was sure of one thing. Vanessa was no longer testing the water. She had already decided to step into it. And if she was asking about Charles's trust on the day we laid him in the ground, then somewhere in that elegant mind of hers, she believed she had a path to what she wanted. What she did not know was that Charles had anticipated ambition long before she ever married into this family. And what I had not yet decided was whether I would stop her quickly or let her walk far enough to reveal the full size of her hunger. After that, I did not stay much longer. I let the room continue without me, which is often the cruelest thing you can do to people who are performing for an audience. Vanessa returned to her circle near the mantel. Daniel drifted back toward the men from Charles's board, and I made my way through the last of the condolences with the same calm face I had worn since morning. No one stopped me when I picked up my coat. No one asked whether I wanted company home. That told me more than any whisper had. They did not see me as the center of loss. They saw me as the edge of the next negotiation. Outside, the late afternoon air was sharp and clean, and the cemetery gravel gave that dry, brittle sound beneath my heels that always makes silence feel even larger. My driver, Thomas, was waiting beside the car, hat in hand, his expression respectful and steady. Charles had trusted him for 15 years. I had trusted him for 14. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly as he opened the rear door. Not Whitfield. Not some softened version of widowhood. Whitmore. The name landed in me like a small act of rescue. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, and slid into the back seat. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, past the stone gates, past the bare maple trees lining the road, past the low brick church where Charles and I had once attended Christmas Eve service when Daniel was still young enough to fall asleep on my shoulder before the final hymn. Memory is strange that way. It does not arrive in order. It comes as light on old glass, as the shape of a hand on a steering wheel, as the exact sound of a laugh from 20 years ago. I looked out the window and saw not the town as it was, but the life Charles and I had built inside it. The first townhouse. The second office. The years when every dollar had a job before it had a name. People who met Charles later in life always assumed he had been born with confidence and capital. They never saw the early mornings when he carried garment bags to trade shows himself because we could not yet justify assistance, or the winters when I tracked every household expense on yellow legal pads while he took flights so cheap they barely counted as humane. What we built was not an inheritance handed down through good tailoring and old family stories. It was discipline. It was patience. It was years of saying not yet to things we could have afforded because we had promised each other we were building something larger than appearances. And when success came, real success, it came because Charles knew how to see value before others did, and because I knew how to protect what we had earned once it was ours. I do not say that out of vanity. I say it because women like Vanessa always assume money belongs to the person who speaks the loudest around it. In this family, that had never been true. By the time we reached the house, dusk had settled over the lawn in a blue-gray wash, and every window reflected the last of the day like held breath. The Whitmore house had never felt grand to me. Large, yes. Beautiful, certainly. But never grand. Grand suggests display. This house had been built for endurance. Brick, slate, old trees, wide steps that did not need replacing every 10 years because Charles believed in doing things once and doing them well. Thomas carried my coat inside and asked whether I needed anything before he left for the evening. "No," I said, "but thank you for today." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Whitmore always said you knew where every real lever was." I looked at him. Did he? Thomas gave the smallest nod. "Yes, ma'am." He said most people only notice the door after someone opens it for them. After he left, I stood alone in the foyer with the quiet wrapped around me. No reception voices. No sympathetic glances. No Vanessa arranging concern like place settings. Just the grandfather clock, the faint scent of lilies someone had already delivered, and the weight of Charles's absence settling honestly at last. I set my handbag on the entry table and closed my eyes for one brief second. This was the first moment all day that belonged entirely to grief. And because it did, I let myself feel it. Not dramatically. Not for show. I simply placed my hand against the banister Charles had chosen himself, remembered the warmth of his palm there on countless ordinary evenings, and let the truth move through me. He was gone. That part was real. That part had nothing to do with money, or Vanessa, or Daniel, or the ugly little story being built around me. But when I opened my eyes again, another truth was waiting beside it. Charles had known something like this might happen. Not the exact words, perhaps. Not the funeral seat or the whispers over coffee, but the instinct behind it, the appetite, the presumption. He had known. And suddenly I could hear his voice with startling clarity, not from the hospital, not from the last hard weeks, but from a quiet evening 3 months earlier in his study, when he had looked up from a folder on his desk and said, almost casually, "When I Am gone. Eleanor, do not answer the first question anyone asks you. The first question is never the real one. I had laughed then. I thought he was being theatrical. Charles was not theatrical. Charles was precise. And standing there in the fading light of our foyer, I understood that the first question had already been asked. It had been asked with pity, with changed seating, with misspelled names, with offers to help me manage what they believed I could no longer hold. The real question was not whether I would be all right. The real question was who would control what Charles left behind. And for the first time that day, I smiled. The study still smelled like Charles. Cedar, paper, a trace of the cologne he had worn for years without ever changing brands because he believed loyalty to small things made life simpler. I stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand resting on the brass knob, letting the room come back to me as it had always been. The leather chair angled toward the fireplace. The antique globe in the corner. 2 walls of books he had actually read, not arranged for effect. His desk was too neat for a man who had left this world only days after working at it, and that told me Janet had been in earlier. Janet had been our house manager for 11 years. She believed grief did not excuse disorder, and under ordinary circumstances Charles would have agreed with her. But tonight the precision of the room made his absence feel sharper, not softer. I crossed to the desk and sat down slowly, looking at the folder I now knew he had meant for me to find when I was ready. It was not hidden. Charles did not believe in dramatic secrets tucked behind paintings or locked inside clever boxes. He believed in order. The folder lay in the top right drawer beneath a stack of correspondence, exactly where he would have left something he wanted me to reach without assistance. My name was written across the front in his hand. Eleanor. No flourish. No sentiment. Just certainty. I opened it and found what I expected and one thing I did not. The expected part was a summary of accounts, trust structures, legal contacts, and a short note reminding me which firms to call first and which ones to delay. Charles knew the difference between advisors and opportunists. He had marked them accordingly. Do not rush Finch. Speak to Helen yourself. Delay any meeting Daniel tries to schedule. Those lines did not wound me. They steadied me. Even from the edge of death, my husband had been doing what he had done all our married life. Protecting the architecture. The unexpected part was a second envelope tucked inside the folder, thinner, cream-colored, sealed but unmarked. I opened it and unfolded a single sheet. If Vanessa begins asking about changes to the trust before the first week is over, Charles had written, she is not guessing. She has already decided what she thinks should be hers. I read that line twice. Then a third time, slower. There was more. Do not confront ambition too early. It retreats, reorganizes, and returns dressed as innocence. Let it speak long enough to identify itself. I leaned back in his chair and looked toward the dark window where my reflection floated over the lawn. There are moments in a marriage when you realize love was never only affection. Sometimes it was strategy. Sometimes it was partnership sharpened by years of observing the world side by side until 2 people could recognize the same danger without naming it out loud. Charles had seen this coming. Not because he mistrusted everyone. Because he understood how money distorts grief the moment grief creates a vacancy. I set the letter down carefully and opened the summary pages again. The $50 million was there, clearly laid out, not as one simple account, but as a structure of holdings, trusts, and protected assets placed where haste and greed could not easily reach them. Charles had once told Daniel that wealth was safest when boring people handled it and patient people controlled it. Daniel had laughed. He thought his father was making a joke about accountants. He was not. My phone rang just then, sudden and bright in the quiet room. Daniel. Of course. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said, and the softness in his voice had returned. I just wanted to check on you. There it was again. The first question. Never the real one. I am home, I said. That was not what I asked. No, I said calmly. It was not. A short silence followed, the kind that reveals who is more comfortable needing something. Vanessa thought it might be good, he said, for the 3 of us to sit down tomorrow. Just to talk through immediate things. The house, expenses, what Dad may have had set up. I glanced at Charles's note. Delay any meeting Daniel tries to schedule. Tomorrow will not work for me, I said. Mom, this is important. It is important, I agreed. That is exactly why it will happen properly, not quickly. He exhaled through his nose. I could picture the expression already gathering on his face, that familiar blend of impatience and self-justification. He had worn it at 16 when he wanted the car keys, at 27 when he wanted us to help with the down payment, and at 39 when he wanted understanding before accountability. "No one is trying to pressure you," he said. "Then you will not mind waiting," I replied. That silence lasted longer. Then, very smoothly, he asked, "Did Dad ever mention changing anything recently?" There it was. Not sorrow, not my health, not whether I had eaten. The trust, the structure, the reach. I looked down at Charles's handwriting on the desk, still strong despite the illness that had taken so much from his body and so little from his mind. "Your father mentioned many things," I said. "Good night, Daniel." I ended the call before he could recover. Then I sat there in the hush of the study, with the lamp casting its small pool of gold over Charles's papers, and felt something inside me settle into place. All day, grief had moved through me like weather. Uninvited, unpredictable, heavy. But beneath it, something clearer was forming now. Not anger. Anger burns too fast. This was colder than that. Cleaner. It was understanding. Vanessa was moving sooner than Charles predicted, and Daniel was moving with her, which meant they were either more confident than they should have been or more desperate than they appeared. Neither possibility favored them. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, returned the letter to its envelope, and locked the drawer before standing. In the hallway, the grandfather clock marked the hour with its low, measured sound. The house remained still, honest, waiting. I touched the frame of the study door on my way out and whispered Charles's name once. Not because I needed permission, but because after 42 years it felt wrong to begin a battle without first telling him I had finally seen the field clearly. By tomorrow, Vanessa would expect me to wobble. By tomorrow, Daniel would expect me to soften. Instead, by tomorrow morning, I intended to make one call, then another, and begin discovering exactly how much of their concern had already been planned. The next morning arrived gray and still, with the kind of cold March light that makes every room in a large house feel slightly more honest than it does at night. I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because grief no longer asks permission once it has learned the shape of your house. For a few seconds, I lay still beneath the linen sheets and listened for Charles the way people do after long marriages, by instinct rather than hope. No footsteps in the hall. No drawer opening in the dressing room. No low cough from the bathroom doorway while he adjusted his cuff links. Just the soft hum of the heating system and the quiet weight of absence pressing evenly over everything. I dressed carefully. Navy wool slacks. A cream blouse. Pearls small enough not to look ceremonial. I had no intention of appearing fragile in my own breakfast room. Janet had laid out coffee, toast, and a small dish of sliced oranges by the time I came downstairs. She looked at me for 1 second longer than usual, the way loyal people do when they are trying to measure whether you need comfort or clarity. "You have calls at 9 if you would like me to put them through here," she said. "Yes," I answered. "And Janet, if Daniel or Vanessa arrive unannounced, seat them in the blue sitting room. Not the library. Not the study." She gave the smallest nod. Of course. She understood the difference immediately. The blue sitting room was pleasant, elegant, and entirely neutral. The library and study belonged to the architecture of authority in this house. No one sat there without invitation. At 9 sharp, I took the first call with Helen Mercer, our attorney for family estate structures, a woman Charles respected because she never confused warmth with softness. Her voice came on clear and level. "Eleanor," she said, and there was genuine sympathy in it. "I am very sorry." "Thank you, Helen. I reviewed the file early this morning," she continued. "And, before you ask, nothing may be altered, transferred, or interpreted informally. Not by Daniel. Not by his wife. Not by anyone." Charles was extremely specific. I let that settle. I thought he might have been. Helen paused only briefly. He also left instructions that no family discussion be treated as legally meaningful, especially not in the first 7 days. I almost smiled. Even now, Charles was closing doors before anyone could pretend they had been left open. Helen walked me through the immediate protections, the scheduled reading of documents, and the practical fact that all key decisions remained under the existing framework until formal review. In plain language, it meant exactly what Vanessa would hate most. She could speculate. She could posture. She could tell a dozen people I was overwhelmed and in need of guidance. But she could not touch a thing. My second call was with Finch Capital, or rather with the junior man who answered first and sounded far too eager to be useful. I delayed that meeting exactly as Charles had instructed and ended the call in under 4 minutes. Some people reveal themselves by pressing too quickly toward helpfulness. By 10:15, I had what I needed. Confirmation, structure, time. It was not dramatic, but then real power rarely is. Real power is often just paperwork arranged by intelligent people before greedy ones arrive. At 10:30, Janet came to the breakfast room doorway and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, Daniel and Vanessa are here." Of course they were. I set down my cup without finishing it. "Blue sitting room," I said. "And Janet, please do not bring in coffee until I ask." Again, the nod. Again, understanding. When I entered the room, Vanessa stood near the fireplace in a camel coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, her hands folded with that same polished concern she wore so well. Daniel was by the window, restless already, his phone in one hand though he had likely promised himself not to check it. Neither of them sat until I did, which was almost funny considering how quickly they had tried to move me out of the front row yesterday. "Mom," Daniel began, stepping forward, "we did not want to intrude." "And yet," I said, taking my chair, "you have." Vanessa gave a soft smile, as if I were a difficult hostess she had prepared for. "We only came because we care about you," she said. "Yesterday was emotional for everyone, and we thought it might help to start organizing some of the practical matters before they become overwhelming." There it was again, the language of concern. Practical matters. Organizing. Overwhelming. Words designed to make trespass sound like assistance. I folded my hands in my lap and let a breath pass before answering. "How thoughtful," I said. Vanessa sat then, graceful as ever. "Charles handled so much," she continued. "And Daniel and I both agree you should not be carrying the burden of the house, the accounts, the administrative side of everything right now." Daniel nodded as though agreement itself could substitute for right. "We can take point for a while," he said. "Just temporarily." I looked at my son for a long moment. "Take point," I repeated. "Yes," he said, growing more confident now that the phrase had been spoken aloud. "Just until everything settles." I let the silence lengthen. People in a hurry always rush to fill silence, and Vanessa did not disappoint. "It would also help to know what Dad had in place," she said lightly. "Trusts, account access, any changes he may have made recently. We are only trying to make sure nothing slips through the cracks." Slips through the cracks. How elegant greed becomes when it has been well educated. I leaned back slightly and looked from one to the other. "Nothing is slipping anywhere," I said. "I spoke with Helen Mercer this morning. That landed exactly as I hoped." Daniel's expression changed first. Vanessa's changed better. Only a fraction. Only around the eyes. But it was there. A brief tightening. A recalculation. "Already?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I find clarity improves the morning." No one spoke for a second. Then Daniel attempted a smile that never reached his face. "That is great, Mom. We just thought family should be aligned." "Family," I said quietly, "should be sincere." Vanessa crossed one leg over the other, still composed, still beautiful in the careful way she preferred, but I could feel the room shifting now. The performance had encountered resistance. Not loud resistance. Worse, controlled resistance. "Of course," she said. "That is all this is." I held her gaze. "Then we understand each other perfectly." And in that moment, I knew she understood something too. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to sense that I had not spent the night crying into linens while she drafted herself into command. She had expected softness, delay, confusion. Instead, she had walked into a room where the doors were already being quietly closed. Vanessa smiled first. People like her always do when the room becomes uncertain. Smiles are bridges for them. Ways to cross over tension without ever admitting it exists. "Well," she said lightly, smoothing an invisible crease at her knee. "That is wonderful. I am sure Helen was helpful." Helpful. The word landed with all the false ease of a silk scarf laid over a locked drawer. Daniel shifted near the window, then finally slid his phone into his jacket pocket, as though that small gesture might make him appear more present, more son than stakeholder. "Mom," he said, "nobody is questioning your judgment." I looked at him, and thought how often grown men say that exact sentence right before trying to replace a woman's judgment with their own. No, I asked. Because yesterday, at your father's funeral, I was seated like a distant relative, discussed like a financial liability, and spoken to as if my own life required immediate supervision. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Vanessa stepped in before the silence could settle too deeply. I think everyone was simply emotional, she said. Funerals bring out awkwardness. People say things poorly. People also reveal themselves poorly, I replied. That took a bit more color from Daniel's face. Vanessa, however, remained composed. She had the discipline of a woman who understood that expression is a form of currency, and she did not spend hers cheaply. Eleanor, she said, softening her voice, I hate that anything came across the wrong way. Truly, we are only thinking ahead because there is a lot to manage. The staff, the upkeep, the taxes, the legal side. This house alone is enormous. I let my gaze drift briefly around the blue sitting room, where morning light rested against the pale walls and the old Persian rug Charles and I bought in Boston 23 years ago. And yet, I said, it has somehow remained standing under my care all this time. Daniel exhaled. That is not what she means. Then perhaps, I said, you may tell me what she does mean. He hesitated. That was always Daniel's trouble. He wanted the advantages of directness without the discomfort of ever saying the ugly part plainly. Vanessa did not have that problem. She leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, simply enough to suggest concern sharpened by efficiency. What Daniel means, she said, is that this is a transitional period, and transitions are easier when responsibilities are shared. Shared, another elegant word, another careful theft dressed in community language. Shared with whom? I asked. With family, Daniel said, too quickly this time. With me. I nodded once. Interesting. Because yesterday family seemed very comfortable treating me like an afterthought. That landed harder than I expected. Daniel looked away. Vanessa's fingers tightened for half a second over her handbag clasp. There it was again, that tiny flicker at the edge of her control. Not a collapse. Just pressure. Good. Pressure reveals seams. No one thinks you are an afterthought, Daniel said. Then your actions have been poorly chosen. My voice remained even, which only made his frustration rise faster. Mom, come on. We are trying to help before things get messy. Messy for whom? I asked. He stared at me. I could see the boy he had been, and the man he had become, and the distance between those two people hurt me more than anything Vanessa had done. For everyone, he said at last. There are decisions coming. There are probably accounts, properties, distributions, tax implications. You cannot expect to handle all of that alone right now. He should not have said accounts. He should not have said distributions. Those were not the words of a grieving son. Those were the words of a man who had already been discussing reach. I folded one hand over the other and gave him the courtesy of a calm answer. What I expect, I said, is that your father's affairs will be handled exactly as he intended by the people he designated in the order he established. Vanessa crossed her legs the other way and offered a small, thoughtful nod, as if I had just made a reasonable but outdated point at a board meeting. Of course, she said. We would just hate to see you overwhelmed while important details are pending. There are moments when cruelty becomes almost beautiful in its polish. That was one of them. Not because she raised her voice. Not because she insulted me directly. But because she had found a way to imply incompetence and devotion in the same breath. You keep using that word, I said. Overwhelmed. It is a curious choice. Vanessa met my eyes. Is it? Yes, I said. It suggests you have already decided how capable I am. Another silence. This one longer. This one cleaner. Daniel broke first. Nobody is attacking you. No, I said quietly. You are simply circling. The room went still after that. Even the clock on the mantel seemed louder. Outside, a branch scraped once against the window in the wind. Janet appeared at the door then, exactly on time, carrying a tray with coffee, hot water, and 3 cups. She set it down with the calm precision of a woman who had worked in this house long enough to recognize when civility was the only thing preventing open fracture. Will there be anything else, Mrs. Whitmore? She asked. Mrs. Whitmore. Again, the name is anchor. Again, the reminder that this house still understood who I was even if my own son seemed briefly confused. No, Thank you, Janet, I said. Vanessa watched the exchange more carefully than she meant to. She noticed everything that mattered. She just had not yet realized how many things in this house had been arranged long before she entered it. Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw, then tried a different tone, gentler now, more wounded than managerial. Mom, this is hard for us too. That almost worked. Almost. Because grief does make fools of decent people sometimes. But I had already seen too much to grant innocence where strategy had left fingerprints. I do not doubt that, I said. But difficulty does not entitle anyone to control. Vanessa lifted her cup without drinking from it. No one said control. You did not have to, I answered. And then I let the silence return, because by then I understood something useful. They had come expecting uncertainty. They had arrived with sympathetic language, softened tones, and practical phrases meant to guide me toward surrender without ever using the word. But now their timing was off. Their composure was thinning. Their concern was beginning to sound rehearsed even to them, which meant they would either retreat and reorganize, just as Charles warned, or they would push too soon. I was almost certain Vanessa would choose the second. Women like her do not step back when they sense resistance. They simply look for a more flattering angle from which to advance. And when she spoke next, I knew I had been right. Then perhaps, she said carefully, setting down her untouched cup, we should all be present when the documents are reviewed. Just so everything is transparent. Transparent. There it was. Not grief. Not family. Not support. The first honest word she had spoken since entering the room. Because transparency, in Vanessa's language, did not mean truth. It meant access. And the moment she said it, I realized she believed the reading would bring her closer to something she had already started counting in her head. Vanessa held my gaze after saying the word transparent, and for the first time since Charles's funeral, I saw something almost refreshing in her expression. Not kindness, not remorse, not even patience, just desire stripped down to its cleanest form. She wanted proximity to the documents because she believed proximity was power. She believed that being present at the table meant belonging at the table. Many people confuse visibility with entitlement that way. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence move through the room and settle where it wished. On Daniel's restless posture. On Vanessa's composed hands. On the untouched coffee cooling between us like an abandoned attempt at civility. Then I said, the review will happen exactly as arranged. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. Naturally, she said. I only meant that families do better when there are no surprises. That almost made me laugh, though I would not have given her the satisfaction. No surprises. The woman had spent 24 hours building a false story about my finances and now wanted protection from surprise. Your concern is noted, I said. Daniel stepped in again, eager now, sensing movement. Mom, nobody is asking for anything inappropriate. We just want to understand what Dad set up. That is reasonable. Reasonable. Another word that people borrow when they want their appetite to sound mature. I looked at my son and thought of all the times Charles had tried to teach him the difference between access and ownership. Daniel had always listened best when the lesson ended in a check. Understanding, I said quietly, is not the same as participation. He frowned. Vanessa stayed smooth. Surely, she said, there is no harm in being informed. No harm. There it was again, the elegant minimization of a boundary she had not yet reached but fully intended to test. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap, not from nerves, but from restraint. Because the truth, once spoken, changes the room permanently. And I was not yet ready to spend it. Not all of it. Not the number. Not the full architecture Charles and I had protected for years by keeping it dull to the outside world and disciplined within. $50 million sounds loud when strangers say it. In reality, real money rarely arrives with noise. It sits in layers. It waits behind trusts, holdings, signatures, and time. It does not announce itself at dinner parties. It certainly does not defend itself to daughters-in-law fishing beneath the language of family concern. I had never mentioned the full amount to Daniel because Charles and I had made that choice together. Not out of cruelty. Out of caution. A child raised too near invisible safety can become careless with visible character. And when Daniel married Vanessa, that caution deepened. She admired nice things too quickly, not with the vulgarity of someone openly impressed by luxury. Worse, with the confidence of someone who already believed she belonged among it. The first time she visited this house, She complimented the staircase, the molding, the artwork, the china, but not once asked about the stories behind any of it. She saw possession before history. That tells you nearly everything you need to know about a person. I think, I said at last, that your father understood the value of privacy better than either of you appreciates. Daniel's jaw tightened. This is not about privacy. No, I said. It is about timing. Vanessa lifted one shoulder the slightest bit, a polished gesture of surrender that convinced no one but less observant people. Then we can wait, she said. Of course we can. We simply do not want things overlooked while emotions are high. I met her eyes and saw it clearly then. She still thought I was reacting, not choosing. She still thought I was a widow moving from grief into confusion, making decisions by instinct and soreness. She did not understand that I had already spoken with Helen, already read Charles's notes, already seen the map while she was still admiring the gate. Nothing important will be overlooked, I said, least of all by me. Daniel looked at Vanessa before he looked back at me, and that one glance told me more than the entire conversation. They had discussed this in advance, probably last night, possibly before the funeral was even over. Not in dramatic terms. No villains speaking over brandy in a dark room. Real betrayal is usually smaller than that. Colder, more administrative. A conversation over a kitchen island. A lowered voice in a car. A sentence that begins with "we should probably help before things get complicated." That is how people trespass now, with spreadsheets in their heads and concern in their mouths. Vanessa set down her cup and rose first. "We should let you rest," she said. "Yesterday was a lot." There was almost irritation beneath the softness now. Not enough for Daniel to catch, perhaps, but enough for me. "Yes," I said. "It was." Daniel stood a second later, slower, less certain than when he had arrived. "Please do not shut us out, Mom." That word again. Us. As if the room had not already divided itself. As if loyalty had not been quietly auctioned the moment Charles was gone. I stood as well, though I did not move toward them. "That will depend," I said, "on whether you continue confusing involvement with entitlement." Daniel looked wounded by that, which was inconvenient but not persuasive. Vanessa, on the other hand, became very still. She knew a line when she heard one. She also knew, I suspect, that she had not yet won the right to cross it. Janet appeared with perfect timing in the hallway, not interrupting, merely existing visibly enough to remind everyone that this house observed more than they imagined. Vanessa offered me a final smile, thinner now, and Daniel gave the kind of nod adult children use when they want to leave with dignity after failing to gain ground. I watched them walk toward the front door together, his shoulders slightly rounded, hers perfectly straight. At the threshold, Vanessa turned back and said, "We all want what is best for the family." It was such a polished sentence that another woman might have mistaken it for sincerity. I did not. "That," I said, "depends entirely on what you mean by family." She held my gaze for one beat too long, then left. When the door closed, the whole house seemed to exhale. I remained standing in the blue sitting room with the cooling coffee and the late morning light stretching across the rug, and I finally let myself think the number plainly. $50 million. Not as temptation, not as a victory lap, as proof. Proof that Charles had understood human nature. Proof that silence had protected more than privacy. Proof that the people most eager to manage me would have spoken very differently if they had known what sat behind the walls of their own assumptions. I walked to the window and watched Daniel help Vanessa into the passenger seat of their car. Even from a distance, I could see her speaking before the door fully shut, already reorganizing, already recalculating. Good. Let her. Charles had warned me not to confront ambition too early because it retreats, regroups, and returns dressed as innocence. But he had also known something else, something I could feel now with complete certainty. There comes a point when the truth is no longer protection. It becomes a blade made of light. And soon enough, I intended to use it. 2 days later, we gathered in Helen Mercer's conference room on the 21st floor, where everything was glass, walnut, and restraint. It was the kind of room designed to make people sit straighter and speak more carefully, which is to say it was wasted on ambition. Helen sat at the head of the table with a legal pad, a fountain pen, and the calm expression of a woman who had seen entire bloodlines embarrass themselves over less money than they imagined. I arrived 5 minutes early in a charcoal suit Charles always liked because he said it made me look like I owned the weather. Daniel and Vanessa arrived together, precisely on time, carrying the smell of expensive coats and controlled expectation. Grace was already there, seated quietly near the window, not intruding, simply present in the honest way that good people are. Daniel kissed my cheek. Vanessa offered me a careful smile. Neither mentioned the funeral. Neither mentioned the seat. Neither mentioned the pity they had let bloom around me like mold and white flowers. Helen began with the formal language, the dates, the structures, the ordinary measured phrases law uses to hold human greed at arm's length. Charles Whitmore had arranged his affairs through layered trusts, protected holdings, real estate vehicles, and specific directives concerning stewardship, disclosure, and timing. Daniel listened with the fixed concentration of a man trying not to appear eager. Vanessa listened better. She did not lean forward too much. She did not ask questions too early. She simply kept her hands folded over a leather notebook she never opened, as if composure itself might qualify as innocence. Then Helen reached the point that mattered. The house remained under my control. The investment structures remained under my control. Immediate discretionary authority remained with me. Certain charitable disbursements would proceed as Charles directed. Daniel would receive what Helen called future benefit under specified conditions and timelines, none of which involved immediate access, interpretive influence, or spousal participation. I watched the words land in stages. First Daniel's confusion, then Vanessa's stillness, then the smallest tightening around her mouth when she heard the phrase no direct authority. There are expressions so brief they almost do not count as expressions at all, unless you are waiting for them. Unless a woman moved your seat at your husband's funeral and started describing you as financially fragile before the earth had settled over his grave, then they count very much. Daniel cleared his throat. I just want to make sure I understand, he said. Mom controls everything for now. Helen did not soften it. Mrs. Whitmore controls the structures placed under her authority. Yes. Vanessa finally spoke. For now. Helen turned her head. For as long as the governing documents specify. That answer was clean enough to cut silk. Silence followed. Not the respectful kind. The calculating kind. The room had changed. They felt it. I felt it. Grace lowered her eyes. Not out of discomfort, but because she had already understood this before today and did not need to perform surprise for anyone. Daniel tried again. Dad never said anything about it being set up this way. Helen placed one hand over the file in front of her. Your father said a great deal, Mr. Whitmore. He was also extremely clear. Vanessa turned to me then, her face composed, her voice gentle enough to sound almost injured. Eleanor, I hope you know none of this changes how much Daniel and I want to support you. There are lies told loudly and lies told beautifully. Beautiful lies are more dangerous because they ask to be admired while they are misleading you. I met her gaze and let the full weight of the past 3 days stand quietly between us. The funeral chapel, the moved seat, the wrong last name, the whispers over coffee, the little campaign of concern she had dressed in pearls and patience. Then I said, very evenly, at Charles's funeral, you let people believe I was nearly broke. Daniel looked at me sharply. Vanessa did not speak. Good. Let the sentence remain unsoftened. You let them pity me, I continued. You encouraged the impression that I would need managing, that I was entering some diminished chapter where younger, steadier hands would need to step in. Helen's pen stopped moving. Grace did not look up. Daniel turned toward Vanessa, too late, as men often do when the architecture of a woman's behavior finally becomes visible in daylight. Mom, he began, I do not think that is fair. Fair, I said, would have been letting me sit in the front row at my own husband's funeral. That shut the room completely. No one moved. No one rearranged a paper. The city skyline beyond the glass looked cold and far away, like another world entirely. Vanessa's face changed then, not dramatically, but enough. The polish held. The innocence did not. I was only trying to make things easier, she said softly. For whom? I asked. She did not answer. So I did it for her. For yourself. Daniel stared at the table. I could see the flush rising beneath his collar, the first true sign that shame had finally entered the room. Not grief. Not frustration. Shame. I turned to Helen. Please continue. Helen inclined her head and resumed, but now the room listened differently. The remaining documents were less important than the truth already sitting among us. By the time she finished, Daniel had learned what he needed to know, and Vanessa had learned what she had feared most. She had no path through charm, no shortcut through sympathy, no claim through marriage. When Helen closed the final folder, Vanessa asked the question she had been trying not to ask all morning. And the total value? Helen looked at me. She knew the answer. She also knew whose voice needed to carry it. I folded my gloves on the table, one over the other, and answered myself. $50 million, I said. The room did not react all at once. First, Daniel blinked as if he had misheard me. Then Grace looked up. Then Vanessa went perfectly still, which is what certain people do when the number in their head is suddenly too small for the room they are in. I never mentioned it, I said, my eyes still on Vanessa, because I wanted to see how I would be treated when you believed I had nothing you wanted. No one spoke. That is the useful thing about truth. When it arrives cleanly enough, it does not need decoration. Daniel looked sick with realization. Vanessa looked something worse. Not shocked. Exposed. The difference matters. Shock happens to the innocent. Exposure happens to people who have been counting too soon. I stood, gathered my gloves, and nodded once to Helen in thanks. Then I looked at my son. Your father built a life with me, I said. Not around me. With me. Do not ever mistake silence for dependence again. Finally, I turned to Vanessa. Her face was still beautiful, still composed, still arranged with all the care she gave the world. But now I could see what lay beneath it clearly and without effort. Hunger. Calculation. The brittle ache of someone who had mistaken proximity for possession. You treated me like I was broke, I said. What you were really seeing was a woman who no longer needed to impress you. And with that, I left them sitting there in the polished quiet, surrounded by glass, legal language, and the ruins of their own assumptions. Charles had been right. The first question is never the real one. The real question had been whether they loved me when they thought I had nothing left to give. Now I had my answer, and it was worth far more than $50 million.